So this lesson is about inputs, and in particular how we can actually get a user to input a bit of data whilst the program is running, and also how we know which input we need to use for which particular data type. So in previous lessons we've looked at actually just having a variable, like this one, whole number, and just assigning it a value before the program actually runs. Now in most programs that's not going to be the case. You're going to want the user to be able to enter in a number. So we do that by looking at these lines here. So we've got our variable, whole number, and we want to be able to input an integer, a whole number. So line 4 shows that we've got a variable, and we want to assign an integer input, and then we just have what's going to appear on the screen, enter a whole number. So I'm going to press run, and we can see that happen here. So whatever you put inside the speech marks within these brackets on the end is going to appear on the screen, and it's going to expect the user to type something in. So if I type in a whole number, 50 will do, and press enter, we then get your number was 50, which we can see from line 5. So we're outputting your number was, and then what was stored inside of that variable which we just entered a number into. It's important to note that if I was to try and put a string into this program, it's actually going to cause an error. So I'm going to run that again. And because we're expecting an integer input, a whole number, if I put in something like Mr. Bailey Young and press enter, it actually gives us a big red error message. It says invalid literal for int. So that means you're not putting in a whole number. So it's really important when we're using inputs that we actually know what data type we want and how to deal with any errors. Okay, now if we want to be able to use a decimal number, we know that we need to be able to use the float data type. So I've got a new variable of decimal number. I want to assign a float input, and I'm just going to ask for a decimal number. So if I run that one, again we can see it says enter a decimal number, and I'm just going to put in 5.7 and press enter. And it tells us your number was 5.7. So in this case it's outputting your number was, and the decimal number we stored within that variable. If I did just do a whole number, if I put in 5, it forces it into a decimal for you, so it becomes 5.0. And just like with an integer input, if I enter a string, Mr. Bailey Young, it gives us that big red error message again. So now if I want to be able to input a string, we're just going to look at this line, line 10. So our variable is word, and we want to assign a string input. So I'm going to run that one, and it's asking us to enter a word. I'm just going to put hello, press enter. Now we can see your word was hello. So in this case we've used the data type string to be able to actually input our data correctly without causing any errors. If I was to input a number, so I'm going to put 50, it doesn't give us an error. However, what would be stored is a string version of 50. So you wouldn't be able to do any maths with it. It's not stored as an integer. It would actually just be stored like that. If you imagine 50 with speech marks around it, rather than it just being 50 like that, which would be a number. So it's really important again that we understand what happens if we input the wrong data type into one of these inputs. Now, as we spoke about in the previous lesson about data types, a character is just a symbol, letter or number from the keyboard. So we'd actually just continue to use the normal string input up here. So if I was to make it a letter, I'm going to change the variable so we can make it easier to understand. So we'd have letter is equal to string input, enter a letter. Now if I run that, I would just enter a single letter, so I do A. And that would just be storing our character. You can input your Boolean data, which was the true or false we looked at before. However, that would usually be done within the program rather than asking for a user to be able to enter that themselves. So it's important to remember that bit as well. So if we're thinking back to the beginning, we know that if we want to input an integer number, we would use int input. If we want to input a floating point number, a decimal number, we would do float input. And if we want to do a string or a character, we would use our string input. So those three are used in very different ways, and some will give errors, some will cause your numbers to act as strings like we showed within the string input. So it's really important you understand which ones do what and how to fix any errors that might occur.